Hello, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Get two chairs. Come on in, Meg. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Meg King. Meg is she's really the diva of nightmare scenarios in cyber. But her formal title is Strategic and National Security Advisor to the President of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for the Scholars, i.e. the Wilson Center, and Director of the new Digital Futures Project there. Meg, thanks very much for joining us. I mentioned you sort of the nightmare lady. Away from you a little bit. Because you've really, in Washington, there are a number of people who are afraid to be the sort of Herman Kahn of thinking the unthinkable, and you've dedicated yourself to thinking more recently, not just generally about what's happening in the corporate area and others, but some of the nefarious players with one of the greater strategic threats the U.S. is facing today, namely ISIS, and profiling some of the, digerati leading ISIS, right? So tell us about Jenna Hussein and what you've been doing.
So I try to be a little bit more positive than that because I think...
no, I'm going for negative here.
Right. We're at a moment where we have an opportunity to take advantage. We can study the transition that has been made from the communications expertise developed by ISIS and some of these other terror groups to what might happen. So I'm going to start with that. Allegedly, one of the standard bearers of the cyber group in ISIS, Jenna Hussein, was killed by a drone strike in August. And what we at the Wilson Center are trying to do is to understand where ISIS is going from there. So Jenna Hussein, we know from a February 2012 interview with him online, was a self-taught hacker from the age of 11. So he started very young.
He hacked Tony Blair, right?
His assistant, yes. His assistant's Gmail account. So to anyone who doesn't have a strong password on their email account, do that quickly. Because it's really, some of these tactics are not that hard. So Junaid, apparently at the age of 11, started playing around online. He got hacked by another kid. Apparently there was a game back in the early, I think, 2010s where you could actually learn how to hack somebody else by stealing cookies. And those are the online cookies, not the real ones. And so he created this organization called Team Poison at age 15. And he decided that he wanted to become a hacktivist, is what he called himself, a hacktivist. And so from the course of age 15 to about 18 before he got arrested, and he's a Brit, so he was living in London, he carried out some basic attacks. He started trying to what's called phone freak or freaking, where you use phone lines and you hack into them. And he actually managed to get into the British anti-terrorism hotline. He recorded the phone calls between some of the employees at the anti-terror hotline and published them on YouTube. So he caused a lot of damage, I think, from a PR perspective. He didn't hurt anyone by his activities online, but he certainly displayed capability and intent. And he talked about the role, and he compared his group, Team Poison, to Anonymous. He talked about the role of internet guerrilla warfare, and I think that's something that we need to be watching and proactively trying to address.
Internet guerrilla warfare.
Right.
Cyber jihad.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be violent attacks. It could be. There are obviously the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, in 2014 made mention in his annual threat assessment that terror groups are actively looking to create or adapt their skills for offensive cyber attacks. So this is a field we need to be watching.
So we know, or we think that this guy was killed. We think that he was helping to structure and lead ISIS's now famous social media activities, engaged in trying to recruit other, digital mavens into the cause. So he's been killed, so why should we worry?
Well, the way I look at this is, if you look at the history of hackers in general, it all kind of, they coalesced around the communications function, right? So they started by phreaking, and phreaking was, started back in the 50s, even before that. Where you would try to change the tone in a phone to break into a phone line. So they moved from that to some basic communications in the early days of the internet relay chats, that sort of thing. So if you look at the way that hackers sort of developed their skills, it was because of communications. And so if ISIS is so good, and other groups, is so good and has kind of made themselves expert in the PR campaign. And they've got amazing operational security, OPSEC, where they have actual manuals that they give out to try to help recruits hide their identities online, use disposable email addresses, some pretty sophisticated techniques. If they can do that, then we don't know what they can do, but we need to be watching it.
So let me ask you a question which I just don't get. If you've got digital expertise at that level, that presumes some level, I would assume, of sophistication, of education, of awareness, of using machines and systems that are, created by, people in the West who are part of, an enlightened world. How are so many people with these skill sets so easily seduced into an operation that has not only kind of a darkness to it, but everything they represent is, to a certain degree, in my view, anti-intellectual, anti-modern, anti-this. So how does that coexist in the mindset of someone like Jenna Hussein?
Well, I'm not a psychologist, but I think there's something in the visual experience, or something in the videos that are sent out, and the tweets and the photographs that they're attracted to. And once they become, if you go back to the Hussein case, if you read some of his quotes and his comments, he talks about how there is a point in which he became fascinated and changed his life. He actually changed, apparently, the way he lived his life, and he started stealing, and he started shifting to this criminal side because he was appalled by the activities he thought were happening in the Middle East, like deaths and that sort of thing. So there's something in the visual experience. That's all I can see. But
so as you're profiling, I mean, have you been targeted because they know you're looking at them?
God, I hope not. But I mean, if you look at the University of Toronto, their Citizen Lab has done some interesting work studying the malware and the sorts of tactics that are being used by ISIS to, at least in this case, initially target their opponents, not necessarily to kill them, but to target them and then to kill them. So I think we need to be watching that.
You've also been, expanded out of just ISIS and sort of looking at the broad problems of digital vulnerabilities and cyber concerns, and that's one of the big topics of today, not just what's going on over there. Last night, I don't know, Annie, how many of you knew that yesterday was the International James Bond Day? Yeah, seriously, there's an International James Bond Day, and it was yesterday. And the International Spy Museum and Jefferson Hotel and the British Defense Attaché threw a cool party last night. And of all people who showed up, Mike Rogers, Admiral Mike Rogers, who's head of the Cyber Command and the National Security Agency, showed up. So I said, if you were going to be here, he sends his regards to you, by the way. I said, what do you worry about? What would you convey at this conference? And he said, I would convey that we have an interesting problem in that in the broader private sector, it's unfair in his mind to blame companies, as some did Sony, in terms of being able to face governments. On the other hand, the government can't shoulder this responsibility on its own. And there needs to be a partnership. Because that partnership is unbelievably messy today. That to take a company and figure out what the on-ramps are to dealing with the U.S. government, which division is one of them, what on-ramp do you use? And so he sort of left that with that question. And I want to ask you, how would you fix that? Because it seems like what we're talking about today is how to promote greater partnerships, how to promote greater revelations by companies that are under siege. It's not a high trust environment, not as high trust as it should be, and you've written about this.
So I think that is one of the ways we can get at this cyber terror problem is we're just going to have to roll up our sleeves and we're going to have to sit down in some closed door rooms where the press, isn't there. And I think that's really...
we're there even when you don't think we're there.
I'm sure you are. I'm sure you are. And really come up with a solid list of things we can agree on, and you've got to start there. Because I've seen...
What are those things?
Well, I think you've got to agree on some of the next level standards. So we have the NIST standards that are voluntary. I think there's some worry by companies that they don't know what the new regulations will be. There's just a lot of terror, ironically. Companies are terrified that there will be regulations that they don't know how to respond to. So I think there are some ways in which we can set standards for, or at least goals for, the next level of regulations, whether they be mandated by Congress, which is unlikely, or whether they be like follow-on for NIST. I think there are some insurance standards that could be discussed and promoted, and I think if business is actively assessing their level of cybersecurity, and that is graded, if you will. There are some companies out there doing that. And then if you reach this grade, then you are at least on the way to better cybersecurity. I think having just some basic standards that are agreed upon would be a huge help.
What's the worst thing that could happen? I mean, be the Herman Kahn for a moment. I mean, tell us what, I learned from our HP friends a few months ago that the Stuxnet virus, which allegedly we helped launch with the Israelis, et cetera, is still kicking around and impacting companies in the US. It's just sort of out there, and so you've got to patch it and deal with it. But what I guess my concern is, and when you hosted Mike Rogers over at the Wilson Center, he talked about trying to develop a doctrine of deterrence.
Mm-hmm. We don't have it for nation states right now.
Well, I mean, what would that? I guess tell us how bad it could be.
Well, it depends on who you ask. Some say that...
Give me your worst case.
Right, okay. Well, worst case is somehow a SCADA system, a supervisory control system that is connected to, let's say, a chemical plant, is reversed, and it causes an explosion. I mean, that's pretty bad. I don't think we'll get to anything that's mass scale casualties, but a chemical plant exploding is a pretty big deal.
Now, you've said that a lot of these plants have analog systems as their last line of defense, so they're really decoupled.
Yes, ideally, but that's changing. And so what, for example, the Department of Homeland Security is trying to do is to work as fast as they can with some of these utilities and infrastructure sites to make sure that not that they just keep the analog, but that they have more backups in place. So as smart technology becomes more adopted, we make sure that there's still an off switch that anybody can press in an emergency. That's the basics.
So a chemical plant. I hate to sound blasé about this, but that sounds like something you could deal with, right? That doesn't sound that's different than a systemic.
Oh yeah, no. You could attack a series of them if you identified a couple of vulnerable ones across the country. You could obviously turn off the lights, for example, in a broad area of the country. And certainly, nation states have proven their capability to do that, at least to plant some malware that would allow them to do that at a later date. But the point is, if a terror group wanted to do that, they could, but it's what do they want to do? And that's what we need to understand, because they seem to like the very large, explosive events. That's why they've targeted airlines and that sort of thing.
So let me share just a short vignette with folks. About a year and a half ago, I was contacted, I can't remember if it was by LinkedIn or something of that sort, as a friend of John Bolton, the Ambassador Bolton. And if anyone who knows, my blog had raised a lot of the concerns and questions about John Bolton being confirmed. He was never confirmed as ambassador to the UN. So I was very surprised to get this, that John Bolton was sending me a note, or his people, saying that I would like to be within this John Bolton sort of secret society on the web, that they were going to have a place for like-minded thinkers.
Yeah.
And so I knew that something was wrong, and kind of played it out for a couple of weeks. And then I called Ambassador Bolton's office and I said, you have somebody out there with a very sophisticated operation that's targeting people in the national security field, trying to get them to go inside something. They had a website that was all about John Bolton, his papers.
Oh, you clicked on the link?
No, I didn't. I went into it without going the extra step.
Clever.
And there was a LinkedIn page, and they conveyed this all over. It was later reported in the New York Times. But and it turned out, which I didn't know at the time, that these were Iranian, possibly state-sponsored efforts to try and get this. And I guess, I thought, well, they screwed up with me, that if I were really a John Bolton fan, I would have done it in a second, right? So John Bolton actually tweeted out that he was grateful to me for letting them know about this, which was historic in a way. So I guess my question is, are we doing that to them? Are we saying, something about, Ali Larijani, the secret, or Rouhani or Zarif or the grand,
To the
the
Iranians,
Ayatollah?
or-
Well, I mean, it just makes me wonder, are we any good at the stuff that others are doing to us?
Yes.
Because we present ourselves in the press as victims of the Chinese, the Russians,
Oh, we're very good.
the Iran. So are we hacking them?
I wouldn't say that we're hacking terror groups. At least I don't know about that. But and I haven't heard it from my intel community friends. But I think there are other ways we can get to them.
What are the other ways? I mean, people say we have other ways.
I think we work with foreign intelligence services, and they have a lot better information in many ways than we do on some of these.
So
some of these
foreign
cases.
operations are better at this than we are?
No, they're able to get
That's a
information.
tweetable line, I just wondered, yeah.
They get better information.
Meg
I
King
think.
says.
Yes, they get better information, I think, in certain areas than we do. And yes, we could try to send the faux LinkedIn email to them. But my point about operational security is they're actually, I would wager that it's easier to probably find them in the human route than the online route, because they are so careful about their identities, unless you're starting a conversation with them on Twitter because you're following their recruitment lines. But I actually think that because of their operational security practices, they're pretty sophisticated in at least protecting their identities online.
Just before I go to the audience, if I wanted to get into this, if I wanted to become a patriotic social media hacktivist on behalf of the U.S. government, where do I join up?
Well, the U.S. government would say, we don't have any group like this, you'll have to start your own, or join another.
Seriously?
Well,
yeah.
No, there's an effort at the State Department called the Strategic Communications Office.
That sounds enticing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they have quite a few efforts ongoing, to highlight.
What you're really saying is it's pretty pathetic.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there's only so much, as you were starting to say earlier, there's only so much the U.S. government can do on at least the recruitment side and in the public space, because it's the U.S. government and it has to be a different messenger. And that's why it's so important to have, whether it's just citizens in America fighting back, whether it's private companies organizing it, whether it's nonprofits. There are a couple of those that are starting. To talk about the deaths of innocent Muslims, the children that are at risk and dying in these horrible conflict zones, chemical weapons use. I mean, it's a combination. There's no one group, and the U.S. government is not able to do it.
I think I would probably go join HP rather than the government. So
yes,
let's take some questions right over here, and we're going to bring the mic over to you. Good morning.
Hi, thanks. Jim Yeager from Fidelis Cybersecurity. You talked about some of the more serious threats, and clearly one of them is the destructive attack. You mentioned Sony. My question is, why are we so slow to learn the lessons? There was the Shamoon attack on Saudi Aramco, wiped 30,000 desktops and servers in a weekend. What a wake-up call. 6 months later, Dark Soul Jokra attack on South Korean banks and ISPs. And then we see the same malware hit Sony. Why don't we learn those lessons?
It's a great question. Why aren't we learning
well,
in the aggregate?
In the aggregate. I think we are, but it's all about kind of relationships at this stage. We aren't there to the point where we can share rapidly in real time the kinds of malware signatures that are seen across this country and the world. And I think a lot of people, at least my friends in the government, would say this is why we need information sharing legislation. And there are two sides to that view. Are the signatures you're sharing too late or too out of date, or is this something that can help us improve and prevent future attacks? I think the problem it's more complicated than just the sharing of information, because you've got different levels of security. And yep, go ahead.
If I could just
on the microphone, since we're online and millions of people are watching and listening.
Yeah, if I could just follow up, because you hit on it. We're actually very, very good at sharing indicators of compromise, IOCs. The malware, the malicious URLs, the malicious IPs. But where we really fall down is identifying the trends and the substantive things that we need to react to.
I agree, and I know there is an effort to create better analysis, and that's one of the things that has been discussed a couple of times actually at the Wilson Center. Better analysis, giving some trend indicators to the people who need to hear them. But the problem is, so that's great to have that strategic view, but then you get companies saying, well, what does that mean to me? So you need to have somewhere in between. You need to match the strategy and the tactic.
Other questions? Yes, right here.
Hi, my name is Brian George. I'm curious about zero-day attacks. You talk about sensationalism, the terrorists like airplanes and so forth. But it's sometimes been thought that a zero-day attack, placing software in places and then using it all at once. Have you done any research on that? Is there any thoughts about defending against that or looking for it?
In the terror space or just in general?
Either way.
I mean, I think zero days are a little complicated at this point for where terror groups are.
Can you tell someone like me what a zero day? And
So
it sounds
zero
like a
day.
great movie
So
title.
zero meaning nobody's recognized that there is a flaw in software
I see.
somewhere in some program, and that's huge. There's actually a whole market now in them. Companies buy them, and so do bad guys. But the point is, it takes some sophistication to know how to use those. So I'm less worried at this point about terrorists using exploits. But I do see the possibility that they could hire someone who does know how to do that. It's very hard to know unless you were trawling the dark web somehow and you happen upon a conversation. But I think it's much more likely that we'll see more and more zero days, which probably happen every day, used in attacks by nation states. So, I mean, it happens. That's how most of them get in, unfortunately.
I'm trying to go to this side of the room. Anyone over here? Okay, you did it to yourselves. No, right here. You guys get an A.
Thanks, Blake Subcheck with EnergyWire. I was just curious, there's a lot of talk about how vulnerable we are, how many flaws and potential zero-day flaws are in our systems. And then you have, groups such as terror groups with the motivation and oftentimes the finances to maybe be able to hire somebody to attack us. I was just curious why there haven't been more destructive attacks apparent. I mean, we're going on almost a year now where electric utilities have reported that there hasn't even been a cyber incident that could really affect the reliability of the grid in any significant way. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that. Thanks.
So I would say, back to the reliability of the grid thing, if you talk to true terrorism analysts who look at these groups every day, it's really, they still care about the sensational attack. So, turning off the lights would be really, really a psychological attack to us. But that's not what they're looking for. And they're also, if you're looking at, in the case of ISIS, they're looking at their land, their physical successes right now, their ability to gain territory. But I think there's something to be said for watching who terror groups ally with, whether it's other hacktivist groups, because there are many of them. I don't think Anonymous would be one of them, but whether it's other hacktivist groups, whether it's criminal groups, we haven't seen that yet, and I know you're saying we haven't had anything in the past year, but just because it hasn't happened in the past year, I don't think we can just ignore it.
Let me just, in wrapping up, ask you one question, because to a certain degree, I think what our underwriters and others are looking at this, why isn't there greater prophylactic action? Why isn't there greater awareness after the incidents like Sony? And I'm just wondering, I think if you're a professional in this area, people think it's an obvious thing. If you're not a professional in this area, it seems that what the digital world was supposed to represent was a way of connecting us all in a high trust situation, a higher and higher trust. But we're being told, no, you've got to have a lot of fear. So we have a higher fear connectivity.
Yeah.
And that's not as cool.
No.
I mean, it's not something that, why would you even want it? Why wouldn't you just go back to cash and vacuum tubes? Because the consequences can be so great. So how do you get that balance between trust and fear right if you're the U.S. government?
If you're the U.S. government. So I would say, look, there have been throughout our history and will continue to be major threats to our security and to our lives. and we can't just stop living because of it. And yes, it may seem scary that there are a lot of inputs in ways that bad guys could take advantage of our communication systems. But I think we need to be very strategic about the priorities, and cyberterrorism may be one that's growing, but to be very honest, it's not the biggest challenge right now, especially in securing cyberspace. So as we go forward, there will be technologies developed, and I know there are a couple about how we protect data, how we encrypt information. Is it in motion? Is it sitting? Is it, because for the longest time we have been using, for example, the firewall is a great example. It's, we decided that it was a good idea to have a fence around our websites rather than to think of a more fluid way to manage it. So I think it's going to take some innovative and creative thinking.
Where can people read about your profiles of cyber jihadists?
And other positive things. So wilsoncenter.org.
Great, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Meg King, thank you so much for joining us this morning.